Global Conservation Corps presents the Rhino Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of Rhino Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. In this episode, I'm talking with Jacqueline Cochrane. Jacqui is an investigative journalist focusing on combating wildlife and organized crime and African peace and security. She's also a communications consultant and works with organizations like the Institute for Security Studies, ENACT, and WWF Khetha. In this chat, we talk about Jacqui's background in conservation and journalism and how she's brought the two together. We dive deep into topics like transnational organized crime in relation to wildlife crime, the misconceptions of the public's view of the rhino poaching crisis, how to combat corruption through creating more trust and equality, the role of investigative journalism in this cause, why we need collaboration between international and local organizations when fighting wildlife crime, and so much more. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. All right, Jacqui, welcome to the show. Appreciate you coming on to the podcast.
Thank you so much, John, for having me.
Yeah, so before we get started, I'd love for you to kind of introduce yourself and give a little bit about your background and expertise just to get us up to speed.
Thank you so much. So my background is actually in journalism. I had a rather erratic journey into the wildlife space, if I can put it that way, on paper at least. But it actually doesn't feel that way reflecting on it personally, because wildlife and this passion for nature has been such a fundamental part of my identity, really, as I think it is for so many South Africans, right? But my personal background is more in journalism. I studied journalism, worked in the media industry for 7 years, then moved into the NGO space, where I had the good fortune of working on a whole range of topics that related mainly to human security, actually. So topics like counterterrorism, weapons of mass destruction, peace building, a lot of stuff with the African Union. And then in later years, kind of more transnational organized crime, which is where my passion for doing something about our wildlife and saving our wildlife intersected more neatly with my kind of work area. And I could look at wildlife crime as a form of organized crime and apply some of those lessons that I learned from that broader peace and security context. So I worked at the Institute for Security Studies for a number of years. I've worked on USAID projects on wildlife crime. I've done a whole bunch of training. I've written some investigative journalism pieces. And at the moment, I'm also doing some work with WWF in this space.
Could you give us maybe a quick overview of some of the main topics you're focusing on right now related to wildlife crime? And then after that, I'd like to kind of backtrack and go into a little bit of how this all came together, all these different disciplines.
Sure. So I am actually just wrapping up a policy brief on the role of technology in combating wildlife crime. We had a session on it, a launch session on it earlier this year, and at the moment we're capturing those inputs into the policy brief itself, which will be published soon. But that was a study that was done last year. And also I'm working on a national campaign to improve the narrative around rhino poaching in South Africa, which is a really, really interesting area of work and very nuanced and complex. But those are the key things at the moment.
Yeah, so we'll definitely dive into that. The rhino poaching crisis, transnational organized crime, I feel like is a big topic, and just defining some of these terms for people listening. But before we go into that, how did this all come about? Was there originally a love for conservation? Was it journalism first? You kind of mentioned, you focused more on crime and terrorism and other areas before kind of combining that with conservation. So what's a little bit of your history and how all these passions came together?
So I was incredibly fortunate to be raised by a family who had this love for nature and for wildlife. Some of my most formative early memories are from Kruger National Park, actually. And as a child, you kind of resent your parents at some point for subjecting you to really long, really hot hours in a car, kind of just staring into the bush. But it became such a formative part of my personality. And and an absolute luxury at that, and privilege, to have access to these wild spaces and to be able to view these animals in these contexts and landscapes. And then through journalism, I kind of kept the thread going, but it was really more in my work in the NGO and development space that I was able to focus specifically on wildlife. But really, I think it's useful to draw a distinction here between a kind of conservation approach and a combating wildlife crime approach, because they overlap, but they're not the same thing. And unfortunately, the combating wildlife crime sort of lens has come about as the rhino poaching crisis has escalated in South Africa, as other forms of the illegal wildlife trade have risen globally. So unfortunately, it's meant that we've had to approach the conservation space also with this kind of law enforcement, criminal justice, combating wildlife crime kind of lens, and that's more the approach that I've been able to look at it from.
That makes sense. And I feel like one of your big areas of interest is addressing some of these misconceptions with the public in terms of wildlife crime and the rhino poaching crisis. Could you go into that in more detail and what some of those misconceptions are and how we can remedy those?
Sure. So in South Africa, at least, there's been an absolute kind of fixation on poaching as the main problem and the poacher as the key perpetrator of this problem. And some of that has come about because we are just so desperate to have a key villain, and conversely, or on the other side of that coin, to have the silver bullet so that we can identify the villain and find the silver bullet in how to address it. Unfortunately, the crime itself, or the crimes that poaching forms just a part of, are far more complex. So one of the misconceptions that we need to address is kind of zooming out and seeing the whole criminal value chain, from the demand that drives the poaching and drives this illegal wildlife trade, to the act of poaching itself, to the way the product gets moved through customs locally and then internationally, how it gets to the consumer. So part of it is really just addressing the fact that there's so much more to the problem than just poaching. And also understanding that poachers are just people. It's great to want to sort of, as I said, have this villain that you can target. And unfortunately, we've seen kind of an obsession with that in South Africa, to the extent that I think there are these kind of, I don't know if it's laser quest or paintball or something, where you can go and like hunt down the poacher. And that type of approach is really not just misplaced, but it's actually really harmful, because what we've seen is whenever there's this kind of disproportionate focus, it actually increases inequality, because it comes from a place, an uninformed place, if I can put it that way. And it actually alienates people more from each other, which actually works in the favor of the criminal syndicates, if I can put it that way. So yeah, looking at the kind of broader criminal value chain, we need to be thinking also more about how we can prevent these types of crimes. And that starts from working with school kids, right? Both in the countries where the animal populations come from and in the countries where the demand for these products come from. So a lot of the time, what we see with any kind of security threat is that it's far easier to focus on the heavy-handed stuff, the interventions that happen on the ground. So in this context, for instance, also the military interventions. It's far harder to look at how do we prevent these problems, right? Because that's something that has that calls for long-term approaches. And it's far harder to quantify as well. And it's far less sexy, because how do we prevent something from happening? It's far easier to talk about something that has happened. So these are some of the misconceptions that we've seen a lot about. Also, as the narrative has kind of shifted from, in the areas where it has shifted from the poacher to focus more on organized crime groups, which is accurate, we've also seen this misperception that these groups are highly sophisticated and highly organized. What we actually see on the ground is that they don't need to be all that organized. There's a great deal of impunity among perpetrators of these crimes because they can afford to be kind of disorganized. And that comes from the fact that it's perceived as a low-risk crime, which it still is.
Talk more about that low risk crime. What's that mean?
It means that people think that when they engage in acts of wildlife crime, they will not necessarily end up in the courtroom seeing a really strict jail term or that type of thing. So we need to improve how it gets treated in the whole criminal justice sort of chain, how it gets prioritized by policymakers, the kind of laws that frame these crimes. We need to look at the sentences that get handed out. And we need to also look at what happens when those criminals then leave. What we've seen is also a high degree of recidivism among perpetrators of wildlife crime. We need to look more closely at all of those different angles. And we also need to look more closely at things like collaboration, because where there has been better law enforcement responses against wildlife crime, we've seen that the criminals move. And that means we need to approach these crimes from a more collaborative point of view and anticipate if the law enforcement responses are strengthened in one area, how can we make sure, or how can we anticipate where it's going to go and make sure that we bolster our responses on that side as well?
Yeah, I feel like there's so much to pull out of all of that you just said. But speaking to the recidivism and just these crimes being perpetrated over and over by the same people, I feel like a lot of the talks with rangers and people connected to that side of the issue, they talk about how many times they arrest the same people and how they catch them, they go to court, they get out, maybe they serve a short amount of time and then they're right out there again because the risk to reward is in their favor right now. And, a lot of people, I'm sure it's a big part of it is these rhinos, when you see the images, that really gets people's emotions going. So that's probably why they're so focused on that part of the crisis. But it's easy to forget all of these other crimes that are being committed to, move these horns along to the end user. Could you talk a little bit more about what those, you kind of briefly went through them, but what those other crimes are and how are they being treated, from maybe someone that's smuggling in an airport to transporting and selling on the other side? I don't know how much you know in that area, but how are those being treated and how can that be brought into a more holistic view?
Sure. So there's a whole range of crimes that have to happen in order for the illicit product, which in this case is rhino horn or elephant's ivory or any number of other wildlife products. But there's a whole range of crimes that have to take place in order for the illicit product to reach the end user. And briefly, some of those are, moving it between borders, firstly nationally and then internationally, and a whole number of laws and conventions and things are contravened in that process. But the key thing is that for all of those crimes to occur, corruption is kind of the thread that runs through all of it. So that's kind of what we really need to look at. Corruption in the Ranger Corps, corruption among law enforcement officers, corruption among customs officials, corruption at literally every single level. And we also need to then think more carefully about what drives corruption and what drives criminality more broadly. A big other misconception is that criminality in this space comes about as a result of poverty. And that's not necessarily the case. A lot of the communities who live around protected areas do definitely need greater employment prospects and greater chances to improve their livelihoods and their lifestyles. But we should really be mindful of thinking that poverty equals criminality. It really doesn't. What the studies have found is that it's got to do more with inequality. And that, again, speaks to the whole corruption spectrum, right? So if you have happy rangers, they're far less likely to be corrupt. If you have happy customs officials, and happy is maybe the wrong word to use, but we're talking about things like basic job satisfaction, sufficient remuneration, having the right equipment to do your job. There's a big lack of that, again, at all levels, among all officials. And then, of course, there's just the organized crime element of it, which goes to the highest levels in most of the countries where we see these problems, South Africa being one of them. So we need to really, I think, regard those elements of criminality from an anti-corruption point of view.
That's interesting. So do you think from your observations that this inequality breeds a certain type of resentment that maybe allows people to justify the corrupt actions that they're taking?
Absolutely. I think inequality is an absolute driver of wildlife crime, again, at every level. What we've also seen is, this kind of disconnect between how there's all these interventions to do something against rhino poaching, but the people who live around these protected areas don't get to benefit from these interventions. And again, that fuels perceptions of inequality. So I know some studies where they've interviewed people who live among these or sort of in these areas. People have asked, well, why do rhinos get specialized medical care? Why do rhinos get helicopters and other kind of specialized forces jetting in and doing something about them when we don't have jobs, we don't have basic services, we don't have access to all of these things? So, I think it requires, a far more nuanced look in that sense, of understanding how corruption works and what our responses to it should look like.
Yeah, I've never heard it put that way. I think it's easy to kind of accept that line of poverty and lack of opportunities, but even just something as much as being treated with respect and fairness probably leads into that, because I've noticed with my short time there that there is still a lack of trust between a lot of people that run these reserves and the communities, and until there's some kind of mutual respect for each other and real conversation over how to support communities and how they can benefit from these areas, it feels like this problem is just going to persist.
Absolutely.
Maybe we could dig a little bit more into, how do you see journalism contributing to making change in this area? I guess that part of that's bringing awareness, but how else from your perspective and the type of work you're doing?
I think there are kind of two main roles. The one is absolutely to create awareness, but also to create, in that context, more accurate awareness. So to make sure that the way wildlife crime is framed by the media more accurately corresponds to what's happening on the ground. And there's a whole kind of spectrum of messages that I think need to be improved on in the media space, and we can get into some of those in a moment. The other key area is for investigative journalism to be able to fulfill its function of looking at things like organized crime in greater detail. And that, unfortunately, is something that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of collaborative effort, often between different countries, between different regions. And as we know, journalism is kind of under a lot of pressure globally at the moment. So we see a kind of dwindling for the resources available for that type of journalism, but it's absolutely critical to tackle all types of organized crime, and wildlife crime being one of them. And maybe a key thing to note there as well is that wildlife crime often intersects with other types of organized crime. So again, in that space, the need for good investigative journalism is absolutely critical. In terms of the framing of the messages, again, a more informed journalist could maybe talk better to what the poaching problem really is about, what who the main actors really are, what the key dynamics really look like. And also, in the context of communities, I think a lot of the time we talk about communities around protected areas as if they're one homogenous group of people, right? But to really show what the reality is like, what the lived experience is like of living in that type of area, whether it's more accurate reporting on things like human wildlife conflict, again, the words that we use, communities. When we talk about communities, it's often shorthand for a particular demographic, a particular socioeconomic context, and we should maybe resist doing that. Also how we talk about things like human wildlife conflict. Why don't we also talk about human wildlife coexistence in the ways it happens more harmoniously? And I mean, I realize of all people that no news is not news, or is often not regarded. But I think we also need to get better at celebrating the good news stories out there. One of the other reasons for that being that we need to replenish the goodwill that exists among the general public. I think there's so much goodwill out there, and it's important to regard that as a resource for better holding to account policymakers also to make better decisions. But we also need to recognize that it's a finite resource. And if we only report on the gloom and doom side and the numbers of poachings and that type of thing, it's a resource that we're depleting without, again, replenishing it. And that's a failure on the part of the media, I feel.
For sure. Do you have any examples of success stories? Because I think that is something that we lack in the news. And it's not just to say, hey, some things are happening that are good, but it's also, here's an example of a way that we can move forward in a better way. I don't know if you have any that come to mind, or just types of stories that we should be telling.
Sure. So I think actually one of the big areas where we can look more closely at those types of stories is by using data journalism, because it's often how we quantify things, and it's possible, for instance, to quantify, if we look closely at data, how many poaching incidents, for instance, didn't happen. That data is out there. And I know, for instance, Oxpeckers has a data set that tells that story quite well, because it looks at it captures the number of incidents where there were incursions into protected areas and people were arrested with the weapons, and kind of where there was clear intent to poach, but the poaching didn't happen. So it's actually possible to tell the story of how many poaching incidents didn't happen. It's also possible to look at things like how technology, and it's something that comes to mind because it's a research area I've been working on recently, but where and how technology has made a huge difference. For instance, and not just new tech, but also old tech in the form of canine units, for instance. It's been absolutely amazing what a difference the redeployment of canine units has made in this kind of space. Those are some of the good news stories. Also, novel approaches that communities, and again, using that word with care, because we really should not describe all communities in the same way, but where there have been instances, for instance, where communities have come up with homegrown solutions to human-wildlife conflict that didn't get imposed onto the community by external actors. Again, in the tech space, some of the innovations that have come about that have been locally developed, that have not been imposed by donors or developers in external areas. So I feel like there are so many stories and innovative things that have come out that aren't really being celebrated, and those stories matter. In the kind of applied research space, we often talk about the fact that you can give people facts and figures all day long, but in order to get people to do something, you've got to make them feel something. And storytelling is one of the most important ways that we can do that. And those stories are out there. Those stories are in these kind of populations around protected areas. They're among the rangers. They're among all these actors. They're among the policemen who work on these topics, the prosecutors. As the media, we need to go and find those stories.
I want to come back and dig more into the community side of it, but first, what are your thoughts on journalism as a whole right now? Do you think a part of the reason that these stories aren't being told is because people have just kind of sold out to the idea that fear and violence and all these things sell more than, maybe make more clicks or sell more papers or whatever than the good news stories? Why is there such a lack of good news?
I mean, I think the pressure on journalists to translate clicks into profits really is greater than it's ever been. And for journalists, I think the pressure has been absolutely tremendous. And I think the temptation there is to focus more on the sensational side of things. But I also think it's really important to recognize that there's an appetite now more than ever, I think, among the public for good journalism and for voices of truth, really, to come out. And I think journalists need to remind themselves of that, and also just to remember that those authentic human stories matter. There's something we're all hardwired to want to tap into, and we need to focus more on those. As much as I think there's this tremendous pressure on journalists to get stories out faster, to attract greater numbers, I think there's also just this massive opportunity to produce better content. And I think it's also so easy for good content to stand its own ground among this kind of sea of bad or kind of misinformation or kind of less well researched information, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a desire for that type of news and information. You even see it, and I don't know how much in South Africa, but at least here in the States or just online, a lot of these journalists kind of being independent so they could go and do their own thing and finding alternative ways to make money, whether that's through subscriptions and things like that. So, and even with podcasting, I mean, people are listening to these long form conversations where it's not the new, the TV news. It's just all little sound bites, and you can't really get deep into a complex issue in a 5-minute news segment. So there is that desire there. But yeah, thanks for kind of elaborating on that perspective. Going back to communities, it is, I feel like I've just blindly taken that word on, but the more you talk about it, it is kind of strange, especially coming from the States. I don't think anyone, unless you've been in South Africa for a while, would know what you're talking about when you say the word communities. It's kind of like, okay, well, any community is a community, but it definitely has a meaning in South Africa, and sometimes probably used in a derogatory way as well. And I like how you also bring up that, they're not all the same. I mean, each area has its own government and leaders and different resources they need and connection to protected areas around them, and approaching them each as their own individual, community or group is important. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more to how those communities could be engaged in a way that's actually respecting them. I talked with Anton Zimba, the ranger that's in the film Rhino Man, yesterday. He's going to be on a podcast coming out just before this one. And he was saying one of the most important things he thinks we need to do in order to solve this issue with rhino poaching is to have these protected areas engage with the leadership of these communities that are near them, and just ask them, first say, wrongs have been done in the past, we admit that, and then ask them what do they need, and what type of collaboration can there be, and just listen and get their response before even offering things to them. So I wonder, I don't know how much you've kind of put time into that area, but wonder what your thoughts are around that and how that type of engagement can happen.
I think that is such a pertinent question, and a couple of things come to mind. Firstly, I think that any combating wildlife crime response, whether it's an anti-poaching unit or a new type of tech that's being implemented, any type of intervention or response needs to have strategically built into it, how can communities, and we'll just use that term in that way for now, how can communities benefit from it? Because it's essential to capitalize and to create opportunities to build bridges and build goodwill. There's such a scarcity of trust between all these different types of actors in the combating wildlife crime space, and a massive lack of trust between the people who are in charge of these kind of anti-poaching units and then the people who live in these areas, the rangers, that type of thing. So it's such a complex context. And one of the key things, I think, is to make sure that any type of intervention has built into it a way to benefit communities. If you're going to put up Wi-Fi towers to improve connectivity for your anti-poaching use, make sure that communities also benefit from it. If you're going to put up solar panels, think about a way that local people can also make use of some of that power. If you're talking about protecting rhinos, how are you protecting the people in those spaces as well? So make sure that communities benefit as well. And I think an absolutely key ingredient to that is doing it with sincerity. There's been such a great deal of, I almost want to call it contrived action in this space, where people have recognized that communities are a key stakeholder, that they're regarded as the first line of defense against wildlife crime. But then a lot of these responses occur from a very kind of one-dimensional space where, again, it actually entrenches this us versus them, whoever the us is and whoever the them are in this situation, but it entrenches those divisions, which again then drives perceptions of inequality, which works to drive wildlife crime in the long run. So to do it from a place of sincerity and authenticity, and to do it from a well-informed space, I think it's important to emphasize that a lot of these communities have been disappointed so many times by so many actors who've come and asked for their goodwill and their assistance. And again, I hate even using the word they in this context, but where there's been so much disappointment and so much letdown. So again, it's that kind of finite resource running out, and we need to replenish that, and we need to harness every opportunity we can to make sure that we do replenish it and build on it. So those are some of the key things. I think the sincerity, making sure that communities benefit from any type of intervention are some of the key things. And then making sure that we do the research that's needed to enable that sincerity. I think a lot of the times also we've seen how people craft these solutions or ways of engaging with communities, but they haven't taken the time to really consider the very complex socio-economic and cultural dynamics around it. So another key thing is really taking cognizance of that complexity. So taking cognizance of historical wrongs, taking cognizance of how those historical wrongs perpetuate into the present and will continue to do so in the future unless they are addressed in a very explicit way. So I think that's the other thing. It's often inconvenient for people to want to talk about those complex dynamics because they are so complex, but it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people want a quick fix and don't actually want to do the hard work of building relationships and trust first before even coming up with solutions or ideas. I think it's a lot of listening and trust building that needs to happen. Otherwise, you're kind of, falling into that, like the white savior kind of mentality of like, we're going to come and help you or fix the situation, but you have no idea of what these social structures are like, the culture, what people really need, and you're just imposing all of that on them, just oftentimes either to get something out of it for yourself or to look good or, whatever the case may be. But yeah, that seems like one of the biggest issues. I mean, in terms of the communities next to the protected areas, I think to me that becomes more clear as we talk about it in this way. But when you're talking about someone like in an airport that might be helping with the smuggling or corruption at other levels of government, how do you think those can be addressed? Because I feel like it's, maybe it's a similar issue of this, we talked about inequality and resentment, but how much of that is coming from current governments or past wrongs, or, where can that change be made in those other areas?
I think in that context, it's really key to learn lessons from areas where they've already been learned, and to look at things like drug trafficking, to look at things like the trafficking of illegal arms, for instance, because we have seen successes in all of these spaces in lots of different contexts, but we need to take a leaf out of that book, I would say, and see how we can apply those lessons instead of trying to reinvent the wheel in that space. So I think situating the problem of corruption, for instance, among customs officials, we need to realize that in that space, wildlife crime is part of a whole corrupt system that is enabled and driven by corruption that feeds into all these other types of crimes. So again, collaboration there, I think, is the biggest thing. Collaboration between law enforcement agencies, collaboration between people working on different types of crimes. I think that's true for the whole sort of combating wildlife crime space in general. The closest thing to a silver bullet that we can possibly have is collaboration. Whether and what that looks like will be determined by the type of crime or the specific context, but it can be between different countries where you're looking at things like mutual legal assistance. It can be between different agencies in one country. So I would say really collaboration is the key thing there, and also to learn from other spaces where there have been successes.
Is that any of that collaboration happening, or what's the current situation of that?
I think where it is happening, it's often happening in a very ad hoc manner between individuals rather than at the level of different agencies or even in a kind of bilateral context. So, and that's kind of the scale that we wanted to reach, but we also need to recognize that often it comes about as a result of individuals who have forged these trust-based relationships between themselves. So in the shorter term, I think a way to facilitate that type of collaboration is really for civil society to create platforms where that can happen. So, and interestingly, now in the time of COVID, where we've had all our kind of conferences and things moved into the online space, I feel that's one of the platforms that has gone missing. And we maybe need to think about that more critically and create spaces where people can take time away from their jobs and really build relationships. So to recognize that consciously is really important. But we have seen collaboration, for instance, between prosecutors and other kind of law enforcement officials or representatives, and where that has occurred, we've seen the greatest successes. So we know it's kind of the closest thing to a silver bullet that we can find. And to again, where there is goodwill for that sort of thing, to harness it. I know China, for instance, has shown a lot of goodwill towards being more collaborative in its responses to wildlife crime more broadly. And I know there were instances in the past where South Africa was not that receptive to it, for instance. So at that level, that is absolutely remiss, right? It's a massively missed opportunity. So I would say just at whatever level, collaboration is something that needs to be absolutely emphasized and leveraged.
Can you talk a little bit to the support that rangers get? I think you mentioned it a little bit in your recent article in Oxpeckers, especially when it comes to the courts, because a lot of these conversations I've had with other rangers and people in the space have said that, a lot of times they arrest these poachers, but then next thing they know, a couple weeks later, they catch the same guys again out there doing the same crime. What's the current situation in a lot of these South African courts, and how can they be remedied? Is it just a legislation issue? Is it a lack of capacity? Is it corruption? What are the main parts of this?
I think all of the above. So corruption is absolutely is absolutely a reality, but we also must be careful not to confuse and mislabel inefficiency as corruption, right? So it's I think if we're going to use that word, we also need to use it responsibly when it's at that kind of granular level. So in South Africa right now, one of the single biggest things that could make a difference would be for the national integrated strategy to combat wildlife trafficking to be signed and implemented. My understanding is that at the moment that is with our police ministry, and it's been pending for a number of years. That would be a big breakthrough moment for combating wildlife crime in South Africa. But I think we also need to look at the kind of ground level stuff and maybe broaden our focus beyond South Africa a little bit. I remember clearly interviewing a group of rangers in Zambia, for instance, who were tasked with looking after Zambia's only white rhino population. And they lacked sufficient equipment, they lacked the right kind of clothing, they didn't have the right kind of vehicle. And when they did, they had a very small quota of petrol to use every week. And they just couldn't do their job properly. And unfortunately, that kind of example holds true for so many contexts across Southern Africa and across Africa in many protected areas. So, it's looking at it definitely from the higher level, looking at the legislation, looking at the sentences that are being handed out, because nothing can be as disheartening to a ranger, I imagine, than arresting somebody and then seeing the same person out doing their thing again. And in that context as well, I think our kind of whole criminal justice system needs to be strengthened. Prosecutors need to be better informed about all the different kind of charges that they can apply to these types of crimes. And that's often one of the easiest ways to get these nice and lengthy sentences for criminals, is to not just look at the act of poaching, but it's possession of illegal firearms, it's trespassing. There's a whole spectrum of other offenses that criminals can be charged for, but it requires a certain level of being informed from, the prosecutorial side. But then definitely looking at the more kind of ground level stuff at the ranges, basic job satisfaction, making sure that people have the equipment that they need, making sure that there's recognition. It's such a difficult job. You're kind of between these dangerous wild animals on the one end and these syndicates who, obviously, if you run into them, or these poachers who will not wish you anything pleasant. So, to recognize that there's the difficulty of the job, and to really make sure that rangers get what they need to do their jobs properly, whatever that means in whatever context. I think you've encountered some of the challenges around what that means in South Africa, but South Africa is actually fares really well in that regard compared to a lot of other contexts.
Is that mostly a lack of funds coming from government, or is it, reserve owners not really taking that into consideration, or the well-being of their rangers or staff, or, what have you seen as the driver for the lack of resources?
I think it comes more from the government level. I think generally with private reserves, the problem is not as pronounced. And again, I think it's because wildlife crime or conservation gets treated as exclusively an animal thing and is not recognized for being something that is far more cross-cutting. When there's wildlife crime, it has implications for, and also reflects on so much more. It reflects on missed opportunities in terms of development. It reflects on governance deficits. It reflects on a lack of service delivery, that type of thing. And the same holds true for the losses and what's truly at stake. And I think it's a failure to recognize that. So it's not just about conservation and biodiversity, but again, there's this far broader kind of impact for what's truly at stake. It's the perpetuating of corruption at all these different levels. And in that sense, it's also democracy itself. It's human security in the sense of where illegal wildlife trade occurs, there's real security issues from a biohazard point of view, as we've seen with COVID and other zoonotic diseases, to name just one of the security implications. Yeah. So it's, I think, a failure to recognize what's truly at stake.
Where do you see the main levers in terms of putting pressure on these organizations that could make a difference? I mean, each country and region and protected area is its own kind of individual situation, but is there something on a more international level where we can actually come together, and a film like Rhino Man maybe bring awareness and action on an international level that could actually have impact?
I think at all levels, it is creating better recognition for how wildlife crime and the illegal wildlife trade is not just an animal problem or a biodiversity issue or a conservation problem, but then also to make sure that, again, at all levels, wildlife crime is recognized and treated as a form of organized crime and transnational organized crime. So, for instance, CITES is the kind of big convention that applies in the space, but we also need an international tool that specifically looks at the organized crime components of wildlife crime. So CITES is something that regulates trade. It's not specifically formulated to treat wildlife crime as a form of organized crime in the way that you would have conventions that look at drug trafficking or the trade in small arms and light weapons or that type of thing. And I know there's a lot of work being done in that space. And that's a key thing for the international community to focus on. And then to look at prevention more closely, to give more attention to preventative measures, and whether that means, projects with school kids, for instance. These often get seen as kind of like nice little community engagement things and aren't recognized as actually crime prevention interventions. that's what it might look like in contexts where animal populations are found. But in consumer countries, what does prevention look like there? What does demand? And I think the same issues that we face with how we engage with communities in places like South Africa, we also see with how we engage with consumer bases in countries like Southeast Asia, in places like Southeast Asia. So again, to make sure that we think about prevention, but engage with other groups from a very sincere place.
I wonder if you could go into an example of how the system is not working in terms of some of these criminals being sentenced or delays. I think that was a big one too, is just delays in sentencing. Why are those delays happening? I don't know if you can give an example of anyone major in the news that's been arrested recently and how they're kind of evading actually facing time for their crimes.
I'd almost be scared to talk about specific cases because I kind of want the facts at my fingertips a little bit better, if that's okay. But
yeah, no worries.
Okay.
You don't have to go into details, but maybe just more generally.
Yeah. Okay. So what we have seen is that there've been several major cases with actors who are fairly known to be involved in wildlife crime and poaching, more specifically in South Africa, that have seen endless delays. There are several high-profile cases of this happening across South Africa in different provinces. And those, I think the key thing there is to understand how demotivating those delays must be, and to think more critically about the reasons for those delays occurring. And if it's corruption, to ferret out the corruption and find out where it's happening. But again, to do so from an evidence base. So I think all actors in the space need to always operate from that space of evidence, from that space of looking at human rights, first and foremost, when we're talking about poachers all the way through. So, but yeah, really applying a criminal justice lens in a far more critical way.
Can you talk a little bit more toward the word transnational organized crime and why it's important to classify this wildlife crime as transnational organized crime and what that difference is?
So I think it's important to think about the transnational element specifically because it has implications for how we look at solutions, but also for how we identify our shortcomings in that space. So what we have seen is where law enforcement gets strengthened in one area, and by that I mean a kind of geographic area, and where criminals then perceive that the crime then moves to another area. So, and often those areas cross national borders. Criminals don't need to pay attention to national borders in ways that law enforcement agencies have to. So in order to anticipate that sort of thing, we need, again, better collaboration, and we need better collaboration transnationally as well. So it matters for both how we identify and understand the problem, but also how we formulate our responses to it.
Yeah, so taking it away from just being an animal problem, like you were saying, where people don't take it as seriously and creates this gap where there's this low risk, high reward type of crime happening, and tighten things up by making it more serious offense and recognizing just the size and scope of these operations beyond the poaching on the ground.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know you're involved with ISS and ENACT. Can you kind of talk about both of those organizations and what they do?
Sure. So ISS more broadly focuses on human security issues across Africa, across the different regions of Africa, in lots of different spaces. So including counterterrorism, including criminal justice, including peace building and peace operations, things like migration and emerging threats. The ENACT project is funded by the European Union, and it focuses particularly on transnational organized crime in Africa. So all different types of transnational organized crime across the African continent.
And your recent talk, what was that, back in January, was the double-edged sword, how technology can combat wildlife crime. What came out of that talk, and what were you guys focusing on specifically?
what we found in our research and what the talk covered was how technology is never neutral, and technology should be thought of as a force multiplier in the combating wildlife crime space. And what that means is when you have functional systems and good leadership, technology can absolutely make a massive difference in the fight against wildlife crime. But in contexts where there is a lack of leadership and a lack of sufficient systems and regulations and processes, technology can work to enable and drive wildlife crime. So we argued for an approach to technology in combating wildlife crime that is strategic, sustainable, and secure. And we kind of unpacked what that meant. So by strategic, we looked at things like technological solutions or interventions in combating wildlife crime should ideally be developed in the local context or from the local context. What we've seen a lot is that donors who are very enthusiastic, and I mean, it's an amazing thing to have all this kind of goodwill and resources directed and towards the fight against wildlife crime. But where you have enthusiastic donors who want people to use specific solutions, but then the solution doesn't match the context. For instance, the temperatures may be too extreme, or animals might remove the camera because it's not fixed, or whatever. So to really look at what it means to develop solutions locally or with some degree of local autonomy and with recognition given to the local context. And also to think about those tech solutions as an asset that has to be maintained, or if you can't maybe get the parts a couple of years down the line, to write that into a strategy so that you don't have these discrepancies between suddenly the tech solution is no longer available to you for whatever reason. And to also think about training in that space specifically. We see a big kind of gap in terms of generational approaches to technology where there's and this isn't always the case, it's really kind of oversimplifying it, but we also see a lot of hesitation to embrace technology among an older cohort of combating wildlife crime actors. And for those actors, it's often just a matter of upskilling people to the extent where they feel comfortable making decisions around tech, because to not embrace the tech is remiss. The tech is going to be there whether you use it or perpetrators of wildlife crime use it. And to not use those solutions is remiss, but it needs to happen in an informed way. So training and ongoing training is a massive thing, but also leveraging the opportunity of tech to attract a younger cohort of actors into the wildlife crime space. So to also in that way elevate the profile of a lot of the positions and employment opportunities around combating wildlife crime, where it's diversified away from, for instance, just being perceived as a ranger job or being part of the sort of boots on the ground, but also looking at data analysts and kind of more tech specialized sort of job profiles, and in that way helping to elevate the kind of employment prospects around that space as well.
Is part of this informing potential leaders in protected areas or conservation spaces on how to respond to, say, like you were saying, donors might come with the technology. They're like, hey, we want you to use this, we'll give it to you. As part of that, kind of empowering them to say, hey, that's great, but like we need a bigger strategy for this. We need to make sure it actually works for us, rather than just taking it on and accepting it and then realizing they've invested all this time and effort into implementing something that a year or two down the line doesn't have any support.
Absolutely. So the research was oriented really at helping people to make better decisions in that space. And the kind of situations where you have these locally developed solutions and where they fully take stock of the local context and all the different dynamics, that's an ideal scenario, but that's not realistic either. So it's really to urge people to make more strategic decisions in that space and to look at these solutions with a longer term lens, and also with a human-centered lens, because tech can be incredibly divisive. And again, if there's one thing that we've seen in so many different spaces, it is that where there's kind of division at this human level, that works to enable or drive wildlife crime in the long run. And tech can enable wildlife crime in the sense that it can entrench divisions between groups of actors. So, for instance, there's a specific tech tool called Seymour that is used in the South African context. And a group of rangers, it was found, had perceived Seymour to be a device or a tool to monitor them, because there'd been a kind of failure to properly educate people, create proper awareness of what it's there to do, what its shortcomings are, how what they do fits into the larger combating wildlife crime chain. So in that sense, we always need to think really about the human angle first and foremost with any tech solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about this space are you excited about? And I mean, you're obviously passionate about this. Maybe even more to, what do you love about the work you're doing?
I think there's so much good news happening out there that we're maybe not very good at talking about, but it is happening and it matters. I think there's so much emphasis now on what's happening with things like climate change, and just if we're looking at how young people perceive these issues, there's far greater consciousness of maybe how humans and then the kind of natural environment need to coexist in a more harmonious way, and how fundamentally interlinked it all is. So that excites me a lot. And I think maybe along with that, greater awareness of what we still have in terms of biodiversity and how we need to protect it. I think in the wildlife economy space, there's often a disproportionate focus on how to make wildlife lucrative. And that's not entirely misplaced. I mean, it's understandable, and we do need to make sure that people benefit from and profit from protecting wildlife and protecting these areas. But we also need to maybe rethink how we attach value to what we still have, and realize that once we've lost that, it's gone forever.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the economic side, but there's also just the, the greater connection to our well-being as a world with these natural spaces. And so many parts of the world, we've already lost a lot of that, and it's been reduced so greatly that it's a delicate situation, because, you don't want to be blocking people's progress and advancement in their own communities and societies by trying to say we're saving these spaces. But I feel like there is the opportunity to do it in a more harmonious way. But those communities have to be deeply involved to make that possible. What's kind of next? What are you working on in the near future?
So I'm working with the WWF Khetha project at the moment to improve the narrative around rhino poaching in the GLTFCA, but in South Africa specifically. And we're looking very closely at how some of those messages around communities are formed, also things like human-wildlife conflict, narratives around the organized crime elements of it, which we've touched on a lot today, things like wildlife poisoning. So it's really exciting to be looking at that and looking more consciously at how we can improve the narrative in order to hopefully make a difference in this space.
Is there anything else, Jacqui, you'd like to mention or talk about before we come to a close?
No, I think that's it. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate being able to share some of my thoughts with you.
Yeah, absolutely. The same. And where can people follow you in the work that you're doing?
They can find me on LinkedIn, Jacqueline Cochrane, on Twitter, Jax_C, I think my Twitter handle is. And yeah, they're welcome to connect with me. I'd love to hear from people.
That's great. And yeah, I'll put those links on the website once we put this podcast up. But thank you so much, Jacqui. Really appreciate you taking the time to walk through all these complex aspects of this issue.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for listening to the Rhino Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Rhino Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who have dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.